What is going on, guys? So today we are going to be doing something pretty simple, which is swapping wheels on my M3 here. Now I love the way these BBs look, but I do like them a little bit more on my other car. I like the look of the contours better on this car for the way the suspension currently sits. We're going to be swapping them over today, and I thought I would show you guys the proper way how I replace the wheels and some tips and tricks to make it go easier. Now there are lots of reasons you would be swapping wheels or taking off your wheel. Whether you're servicing your brakes, or you got a flat tire, or you got a hot new set of wheels that you're going to be installing. And we're basically just going to be going over certain aspects of removing a wheel and some things you want to keep in mind when replacing your wheels or pulling them off or putting them back on. So the tools we will be using are pretty basic and pretty simple, but also depend on the tools you have or the tools you have access to at the current time. We'll either be using a 1/2-inch driver, the factory lug removal wrench, or an impact, be it electric or pneumatic. Either of them will work fine. For the wrenches and impact, we will also need a 17mm impact socket or just a regular socket if you're just using a 1/2-inch driver. We will also be using a torque wrench. So I highly recommend torquing your wheels whenever you pull them on or off. If you don't have access to a torque wrench, get them nice and tight and then go straight to a tire shop and ask them to torque your lugs for you. I firmly believe torquing lugs is the only way to correctly tighten them. It basically puts even load on the entire wheel, and you won't have to worry about either warping the face of the rotor or the wheel, or just bad things can happen when you don't torque your lugs. The wheel might fall off, you never know. So I highly recommend getting a torque wrench if you're going to be taking your wheels on and off constantly. But if you're doing it just once, using these standard wrenches will work just fine. And then make sure to have your lugs torqued after, just to prevent any future issues. We will also be using a jack. I will also leave a video link in the description on how to jack up your car. So if you're installing or reinstalling a factory set of BMW M3 wheels, be it Contours, DS1s, DS2s, whatever, the wheels are staggered, meaning the rear tires are bigger than the front tires. So on the left there you can see the front tires, and on the right we got the rear tires. So the rear tires are 245 versus the front's 225, and if you don't know tire sizes, it basically means the rear tires are 20mm bigger than the front tires. The wheels are also an inch larger. The front wheels are 7.5 inches wide and the rears are 8.5 inches wide. So just one thing to note when you're putting them on, don't put the fronts on the rears and don't put the rears on the front. Another thing to look for is the tires you have on the wheels. So on the left side we have just standard tires. These tires mount inside and outside. They fit either way. On the right side, on the rears, I have directional tires. And if you look at the tread, you can kind of see that the tread is pointing in one direction only. So you can look on the actual tire and it will tell you if it's directional. It'll have a rotation and it'll have the arrow pointing that way. So if you look at the set of tires I have on the rears, you'll notice that it says rotation right here and it rotates that direction. So with the face of the wheel being this way, that will rotate to the left. So that is going to be my left rear tire. And if you look at the other tire, you will notice the direction is going the opposite direction. So that will be my right rear tire. If you can't find where it says rotation on the tire, it's probably just a neutral tire. Putting your directional tires on backwards will slightly decrease grip and will not separate or run through the water as well. So your wet traction will be decreased, and make sure to not put them on backwards basically. Alright, so now we're going to start taking the tire off. Now one thing to note before we start jacking up the car is depending on the tools you are going to be using to remove the tire will sort of dictate how you start taking off the tire. If you're going to be using a standard tire wrench like the one that came with the car, or just a regular 1/2-inch driver with a socket on it, you will have to crack the nuts loose before you jack the wheel up. Now if the wheel's in the air and you try and take it off with just a standard hand wrench, the wheel is actually just going to rotate and you're not going to be able to get it off. So make sure to crack them before you start jacking up the tire. On the other side, if you're using a pneumatic impact or an electric impact, these things produce enough torque to be able to rip the lugs off without rotating the wheel while it's in the air. So if you're going to use an impact, jack it up and then rip them off. So we're going to start just by cracking them. When the wheel is on the ground, do not take the lugs all the way out. Just get them loose. So you don't want to be pulling the lugs out all the way, because again the car is supported by the weight of the wheel, and if you take all the bolts off that are holding the wheel on, the wheel could just fall off with the car still on the ground, and then you have a good bit more issue than just pulling your wheel off. So I got my driver here and we're going to put it on the lug so you can see that sort of got it loose. So now I'll be able to crack that off when the wheel is in the air. We're just going to go all the way around and do that. Same thing if you're using the factory tool. Just get them all nice and loose. And from here, basically, we're just going to jack up the car. Now, one thing to note is to make sure that the tire is off the ground completely. I always check this by seeing if I can actually spin the wheel while it's off the ground. And if it spins, then you know it's completely off the ground and the tire isn't touching the ground, which is good because then you'll be able to get the wheel off. You can get the chassis off the ground, but if it's not high enough to pull the wheel off, you're not going to be able to get the wheel off. So from here, we're basically just going to pull the rest of the lugs off. If you can sort of hold the wheel with your knee, it'll help you get the rest of them off. Or if you have an impact, you can just run them off. From there, the wheel just basically pops out. Now from here is where you would service your suspension or your brakes, or basically do whatever you're going to do with the wheel off. So we're going to be installing the factory contours that came on the convertible. We're going to be putting them on this car. But one thing to note with factory M wheels that I've noticed is that they come with these nice little spacers. So I'm actually not sure if these are OEM, but since both M3s that I've bought have had factory wheels with spacers, I'm going to go ahead and say that they're probably OEM. I don't see any BMW markings on them, so I'm not 100% sure, but since both cars have had them, it's likely that they are factory. So when installing spacers on your car, one thing to note, do them properly. Get some nice hub-centric spacers. And what I mean by that is that the spacer fits around this hub. It fits perfectly into this little circle here. So you'll notice when it's on there and lined up, the lug holes are lined up basically perfect. Non-hub centric spacers will allow you to just shift it around on the hub. They're basically called lug centric, which means they're centered onto the wheel by the lugs and not the hub, which is bad form. So another thing to note if you're installing spacers is the lug nuts that go on. So this is the spacer lug nut and this is just a factory lug nut, and you can notice that it's actually extended. The threads are longer to account for the space that spacer will be taking up. Vice versa, if you're taking off spacers and just putting on a nice set of wheels that don't require spacers, be sure to get some different lug nuts that are not as long as the ones needed for the spacer, and it's just bad. It won't work with these longer lugs. So from here we're basically just going to install the wheels. So most German cars use a lug bolt instead of a lug nut, meaning the threads are on the bolt instead of on the hub on the car. So they can be a little bit tricky the first couple times to get them on properly because you don't really have a set section of lines or threads like normal cars to put the wheel on. You sort of have to match it up and then put the lug through. So it can be kind of tricky. So what I like to do is I have a hole here and I have a hole here, right? And I'm gonna basically match the holes on the wheel up with the holes on the hub. Now I'm going to put my knees sort of on the outside of the wheel and grab it by the face here so I can lean back and lift the wheel up, so I'm not like trying to lift it up just with my arms, because that can be kind of a pain. So I'm basically lifting the wheel with my legs and back, so I'm leaning backwards to lift the wheel up. And then from there I'm using just my hands to put the wheel on the hub. So up on the hub there, and I can usually get it lined up first try. There we go, that's on. It looks like it's a little bit easier than it actually is. It's kind of a trick, but once you get it down, it's pretty easy. From here, we're basically just going to be threading the lugs on by hand. Give them a good couple of turns, just to sort of guide the threads on. So from here, we're basically just going to tighten them down hand tight for now. Make sure to tighten them down in a star pattern, so this guy that way, so in a star pattern. That'll basically bring the wheel on center, instead of if you just go in a circle, it's going to be like tighter up here at first and then tighter down here, and it can sort of, in a little way, it'll make the wheel sort of go like that onto the hub. From what I understand, this way doing the star pattern, it just brings the whole thing nice and flat. So we're just going to get them all nice and tight by hand. So there's hand. And if you're tightening them down with an impact, be sure to use a low speed. So this impact has a high speed and it has a low speed. Now you don't want to just freaking run them on with an impact because you can really mess some things up. So if you only have a high-speed impact, make sure to feather them on. Don't just freaking lag them on super hard with an impact, 'cause you'll do some damage to the threads or to the lug bolts. So once it's on, we're going to want to lower the car just to the point where the tire is touching the ground. So notice that the weight of the car is still being supported by the jack, but the tire is on the ground. So I can't rotate the tire. So basically from here, we're going to be doing the final tightening of the lugs. If you're just using the little wrench that came with the car, or just a 1/2-inch wrench, I would put them on and I would sort of step on it until they're fairly tight. Don't stand on it and put all your freaking weight on it. Don't He-Man it, because you'll mess something up. You should be torquing them to 89 foot-pounds, and 89 foot-pounds is not as much as you would think it is, so don't just stand on it if you don't have a torque wrench. Make sure they're really nice and tight, but don't just freaking murder them. And if you do have a torque wrench, we're going to be torquing them at 89 foot-pounds, but keep in mind, you want to go in a star pattern again. Even if you're not torquing it, still tighten them in a star pattern. And once they're all tightened and torqued down, we can lower the rest of the car. And there we go, the other wheel is now on the car. So basically it's the same procedure for the rest of the wheels. Just crack them loose, jack the car up, pull the lugs off, pull the wheel off, get the new wheel on, tighten it all down and send it. So one thing to note with the rears, if you rip the parking brake, this hub won't spin at all. So if you're having a problem with the front spinning whenever you try to put the wheel on, you sort of just gotta get it in the spot and get it on right. With the rears, the hub will be locked if you rip the parking brake, so you don't have to worry about the hub spinning around as you try and put the wheel on. And another thing, I'm gonna move the wheel off for a second. If it's off the hole, the lug won't go in, right? So if you sort of push the lug in and spin the wheel, you see how it dropped in? Then you can thread it on. So if you're having trouble with it getting on the lug holes, just sort of move the wheel back and forth and push in with the socket until it clips in. And that's a pretty simple way to get it on the rears. With the fronts, it's a little bit trickier, because if you try and rotate the wheel like that, the hub's going to spin with the wheel. Alright, so I guess this is kind of a tip, but this is sort of how I like to do things. I like to just thread them in by hand. I don't use a wrench or anything. Just thread them in by hand as tight as they'll go, and then from there drop it and torque it. So I don't touch them with a wrench or an impact on the install at all. I just tighten them down with my hand with the socket. And then when you lower it, you barely kiss it. So the weight of the car isn't being held up by the wheel, just the wheel is touching the ground enough, tire to touch the ground and not allow it to rotate. And so this way you can also feel how they're threading into the hub. Like if you had a lug that had a little spot that was starting to strip or thread out, you'd actually be able to feel it on your hands. You'll know to be careful on that particular lug. So basically you can feel it if it's starting to strip. If you just run it on with an impact, you're going to have no idea, and you could possibly make it even worse if it's starting to go. There we go, now our wheels are on. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.
You should take it slow.